A black major general is attacked and wrongfully arrested by a racist police officer, but what happens to the racist officer shocks everyone. "You don't belong here." Those were the first words that cut through the night, sharp and cold, as the blue and red lights flashed against the side of a restaurant's parking lot. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that makes your heart pound just a little harder, even when you're just a bystander. People slowed down, whispering to each other, glancing nervously at the scene unfolding in front of them. The Major General had just finished a quiet dinner with a few friends, a rare moment of calm between responsibilities. As he stepped out, ready to head home, he didn't expect to be surrounded by flashing lights, a patrol car pulling up too fast, and a white officer stepping out with a glare that felt like a punch. The man in uniform didn't hesitate, striding forward with an authority that seemed to suck the air out of the parking lot. "Hands where I can see them," the officer snapped, his voice carrying across the lot. Confused, the Major General raised his hands slowly, trying to keep his cool. There was no reason for this. No crime, no disturbance, just a man walking to his car. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, calm, measured. The officer didn't answer. He just stepped closer, eyes narrowing, as if looking for a reason to make the situation worse. "I said, hands where I can see them. Turn around." The people around started to gather, some taking out their phones, unsure of what they were witnessing. A couple in a nearby car exchanged nervous glances, the woman muttering, "What's he doing wrong?" The Major General turned around, his posture straight, his breath steady. "I don't understand what's happening. Can you tell me what this is about?" The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "You're trespassing, that's what. I've seen your kind hanging around here before. Don't think your uniform makes you any different." There was a moment of stunned silence. The Major General's jaw tightened, but he held back. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the camera phones, the hushed whispers. "I'm a U.S. Army officer," he said, his voice steady. "I've served this country for over 2 decades. I'm not trespassing." The officer stepped closer, almost chest to chest, invading his space. "I don't care who you think you are," he said, his voice low, menacing. "Get on the ground, or I'll put you there myself." A gasp rippled through the crowd. People were murmuring now, louder, unsure if they should intervene. "This isn't right," someone said, "he hasn't done anything wrong." But the officer didn't care. He moved with a sudden, violent force, grabbing the Major General by the arm and shoving him down, pressing his knee into his back as he reached for his cuffs. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" The words were spat out, dripping with disdain. "I don't care about your rank. I don't care about your medals. You're under arrest." The Major General's face pressed against the cold pavement, his hands twisted behind him, and for a moment, he felt the world slow down. How did it come to this? How could someone like him, who had dedicated his life to protecting others, who had served with honor and integrity, be treated like a criminal without reason? There were murmurs of protest from the crowd. "He's a soldier," one man shouted. "Let him go." Another voice called out, "What's he done? You can't do this." But the officer wasn't listening. He was focused, almost smug, as he tightened the cuffs around the Major General's wrists, pulling them tight until it hurt. The cameras were rolling, catching every moment, every injustice, every unnecessary act of aggression. And through it all, the Major General kept his head up, refusing to let this break him. But inside, he was reeling. He had faced danger, seen combat, survived threats, but this was different. This was personal. This was a humiliation that he couldn't fight back against, not here, not now. For those watching, it was like a nightmare unfolding in real time. They saw a decorated officer, a man who had sacrificed so much, treated as if he were nothing. "Is this really happening?" someone whispered, disbelief clear in their voice. But it was happening, and there was nothing to stop it. The news spread quickly. Within hours, the story was everywhere: decorated U.S. Army Major General wrongfully arrested. The footage was played on repeat, shared on social media, debated on news channels. People were outraged, demanding answers. How could this happen? What had he done wrong? Why was a man of his stature, his service, being dragged through the mud by someone with a badge and a grudge? As the headlines grew louder, so did the calls for justice. Protests erupted, not just in the city, but across the country. People gathered with signs, chanting his name, demanding accountability. They saw in him a reflection of a struggle they knew all too well, and they weren't going to let this go quietly. But behind the scenes, the wheels were turning. Investigations were launched. Reports were filed. And slowly, a different story began to emerge. The officer wasn't just acting out of a moment of rage. There were things in his past, complaints, warnings, incidents that had been swept under the rug. And now, with all eyes on him, there was no place left to hide. The Major General, meanwhile, sat in a holding cell, waiting, still in disbelief. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, but this felt like an attack on who he was, on everything he had worked for. And he wasn't sure how to fight back. But he would learn, and when he did, he would make sure the truth came out. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. As the case grew, so did the pressure. And then, it happened. A piece of evidence surfaced, something that would turn everything upside down, something that no one saw coming. But what was it? What did they find, and how would it change the course of this story? Could justice really prevail, or was this just another example of a system stacked against those who dared to stand tall? Stay with us as we dive into the full story, uncover the hidden truths, and see just how far one man's courage can go when the world seems set against him. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this loud and clear: here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or prejudice. We believe in equality, justice, and the dignity of every individual, no matter their background. Our goal is to share stories that spark conversation, open minds, and shed light on real issues. We're proud to be a platform that supports and uplifts voices, especially those who have been silenced or overlooked. We hope you enjoy the journey you're about to experience. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you never miss a story. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. It was a cool evening in Baltimore, and the city was settling into its usual rhythm of lights, sounds, and the murmur of life. The streets were busy, but not chaotic, a typical night where people were unwinding from their day. Among them, Major General Terrence Walker moved with a quiet sense of purpose. He was a man who carried himself with dignity, his posture straight and his gaze steady. At 45, he had spent more than half his life in the service of his country, earning respect not just through his rank but through his unwavering integrity. His dark, sharp eyes spoke of someone who had seen more than his share of hardships, both on the battlefield and off it. Yet, despite the challenges, he was known for his calm demeanor, his ability to diffuse tension, and his natural leadership. Terrence had grown up in West Baltimore, in a neighborhood where the odds were rarely in anyone's favor. He was no stranger to adversity, having faced it head-on from a young age. Raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for him and his younger sister, he had learned early on what it meant to be responsible, to protect, and to stand up for what was right. The military had been a way out, but it was also a way forward, a chance to do something bigger than himself, to serve a cause he believed in. Over the years, he had built a reputation as a dependable, courageous leader, someone who didn't just give orders but earned the loyalty of those under his command. His service had taken him across the world, from conflict zones in the Middle East to disaster relief missions, but Baltimore was home. It always had been. That evening, Terrence was enjoying a rare moment of downtime. He had just finished dinner at a local restaurant with a couple of old friends from his days in the service. They had laughed, reminisced, shared stories of their time overseas, memories that seemed both distant and vivid, the kind that left you feeling a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. After the meal, they stepped out into the parking lot, shaking hands, promising to keep in touch, and then parted ways. Terence was heading to his car when he noticed the approaching patrol car. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, Baltimore was a city where the police were always on alert, and seeing a squad car was nothing unusual. But the car didn't pass by. It slowed down, then stopped, and out stepped Officer Jared Thompson. Officer Thompson was in his early 30s, with a buzz cut and a stocky build. He had a reputation on the force, though not necessarily a good one. He was known for being strict, often overly so, with a record of multiple complaints filed against him. Yet, he had managed to avoid any serious repercussions, thanks in part to a network of colleagues who looked the other way. Thompson was ambitious, but his ambition was tainted with arrogance, and he had a chip on his shoulder that seemed to get heavier with each passing day. For him, the badge was a symbol of power, a tool to assert control rather than to protect and serve. As he walked up to Terence, there was an unmistakable hostility in his eyes, a look that immediately put Terence on edge. "Evening, sir. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Thompson asked, his tone sharp, almost accusing. Terence was taken aback. "I'm just heading to my car, officer. I had dinner with some friends. Is there a problem?" Thompson's lips twisted into a smirk, as if he had been waiting for that response. "Friends, huh? Mind if I see some ID?" Terence hesitated for a second, confused. "I don't see why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." But Thompson didn't back down. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. ID, now." His hand hovered near his belt, where his baton and cuffs were visible, a silent, menacing reminder of the power he held. The tension between them was palpable, and as Terence slowly reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. He had faced hostile forces in combat, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this confrontation, here, in his own city, from someone who was supposed to protect it. When he handed over his military ID, Thompson glanced at it, then looked up with a sneer. "Major General, huh? Well, look at you," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Doesn't mean you can just walk around wherever you want." Terence's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer. I'm just trying to get home." But Thompson wasn't done. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, searching for a reaction. "You military types think you're untouchable, don't you? Think that uniform gives you a free pass. But not tonight." Terence's heart began to pound, not out of fear, but out of frustration, anger, and disbelief. He had spent years defending his country, wearing that uniform with pride, and now, here he was, being treated like a suspect for no reason. "I don't know what you think this is, but I'm not looking for any trouble. I just want to get to my car and go home," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. Thompson's face hardened. He stepped back, pulling out his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Terence's eyes widened. "What? You can't be serious." "I haven't done anything," I said, "turn around." Thompson shouted, loud enough to draw the attention of a few people nearby. "You're under arrest for trespassing." It was surreal, almost like a bad dream. Terence had never imagined that he would find himself in this position, not here, not like this. He felt the cold steel of the cuffs close around his wrists, felt the rough shove as Thompson forced him down against the hood of his own car. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, some recording the scene on their phones, others watching in silent shock. "I'm not resisting," Terence said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady, even as the cuffs bit into his skin. "But this isn't right." Thompson leaned in close, so that only Terence could hear him. "I don't care what you think is right. Out here, I make the rules. For the people watching, it was a jarring, uncomfortable sight, a decorated major general, someone who had served with honor, now humiliated, treated like a criminal in front of everyone. And for Terence, it was a moment that would change everything. He had faced enemies before, but never like this. Never so close to home, never in a way that felt so deeply personal, so unjust. As he was pushed into the back of the patrol car, he caught a glimpse of the people around, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and sympathy. He saw the cameras, the phones, the flashing lights, but all he could feel was the weight of the cuffs on his wrists, and the bitter taste of humiliation. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been in his place, everyone who had been made to feel less than, who had been treated unfairly, simply because of who they were. And as the car pulled away, leaving the onlookers behind, Terence made a silent promise to himself: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Terence sat in the holding cell, his mind racing as he replayed the events of the night over and over. The cold metal of the bench pressed against his back, and the harsh fluorescent lights above made it impossible to find any comfort. He had faced situations of life and death, moments of intense pressure on foreign soil, but none of that had prepared him for this. There was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't shake off, a mix of anger, humiliation, and a deep, burning sense of injustice. He thought of calling someone, but then again, who? How would he even begin to explain this? The questions ran through his mind, colliding and twisting, as if trying to make sense of something that simply didn't. The silence in the cell was interrupted by the sharp sound of the door opening. Terence looked up to see a man in a suit walking in, his expression serious and composed. "Major General Walker," the man asked, stepping closer. "I'm Daniel Reed, your attorney. The military reached out to me, and I'm here to get you out of this mess." Terence studied Daniel for a moment, trying to gauge the man's intentions. "So they know?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They know," Daniel confirmed. "And they're not happy. But we have to be careful. This isn't just about what happened tonight, Terence. This has the potential to blow up into something much bigger. I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Terence took a deep breath, and then he began to recount the events, every detail, every word exchanged. As he spoke, Daniel's expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to a grim understanding. When Terence finished, there was a long silence between them. "This isn't just an arrest," Daniel said, finally breaking the silence. "This was an attack. They targeted you. This officer, Thompson, he knew who you were, and he went after you deliberately. We're going to have to dig deeper, and it's not going to be easy." "Why?" Terence asked, his eyes narrowing. "Why would he do this?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "I've been doing some quick research while you were brought in. Thompson has a history, complaints, incidents, things that should have been dealt with a long time ago. But they weren't. Someone's been protecting him. And I think you being in that parking lot tonight was a convenient opportunity for him to make a statement." Terence clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "So what happens now?" "We fight," Daniel said simply. "We're going to get you out of here, and then we're going to make sure this doesn't disappear. But I need you to stay strong. They're going to try and make this about you, about your actions. We can't give them any room to twist this." A few hours later, Terence was released, but the ordeal was far from over. As he stepped out of the police station, he was greeted by a crowd of reporters, their cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his face, voices all talking at once. "Major General Walker, can you tell us what happened? Were you resisting arrest? Do you think this was racially motivated?" The questions came like bullets, rapid fire, each one more invasive than the last. Terence hesitated, feeling the weight of every eye on him, every lens capturing his every move. But before he could respond, Daniel stepped in. "No comments at this time," he said firmly, guiding Terence through the throng of reporters and into a waiting car. Inside the car, the noise of the outside world was muted, but the tension remained. Terence stared out the window, his mind still reeling. "This is going to get worse, isn't it?" he asked, breaking the silence. Daniel didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the road. "Yes," he said. "Before it gets better, it's going to get a lot worse." The story had already started to spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it was all over the news, and social media was ablaze with opinions. Some people were outraged, demanding justice for Terence, while others, parroting the statements from the police department, argued that he must have done something to provoke the arrest. It was as if the entire country had chosen sides, and there was no room left in the middle. Meanwhile, Thompson was back at the station, sitting across from his superior, Captain Morris. "What the hell were you thinking, Jared?" Morris demanded, slamming a file down on the desk. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" Thompson remained unfazed, leaning back in his chair. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice calm, almost smug. The guy was acting suspicious. "I handled it." Morris glared at him, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't the first time, Jared. You've been skating on thin ice for a long time. Do you think I don't know about all the complaints? The way you act on the streets?" Thompson's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond. "We're under a microscope now," Morris continued. "If there's anything in your past that could make this worse, you better tell me right now." But Thompson only smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "There's nothing to tell, Captain. I did my job. If people don't like how I do it, that's their problem, not mine." Back at his apartment, Terence was trying to process everything. He knew this wasn't just about him. The outpouring of support, the messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, it all pointed to something bigger. This was a moment that could change things, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Daniel asked, his voice cautious. "They're going to dig up everything, try to paint you as the bad guy. It's going to get ugly." Terence nodded. "I know. But this isn't just about me anymore. If we back down now, they win. And I'm tired of people like Thompson thinking they can get away with this. If we don't fight, nothing changes." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But you should know, I've been digging into Thompson's past, and I think we've found something. It's not definitive yet, but if it checks out, let's just say, this whole thing might take a very different turn." Terence's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find?" "Not yet," Daniel said, holding up a hand. "I need to be sure before we make any moves. But if it's what I think it is, then Thompson's in a lot more trouble than he realizes. We'll need to play this carefully, but it could change everything." Terence leaned back, his mind swirling with possibilities. He could feel the tension building, the weight of what was to come pressing down on him. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about justice, about making sure no one else would have to go through what he had. But what was this revelation? What did Daniel discover that could turn the tables so drastically? The car moved through the dark streets of Baltimore, the city lights casting flickering shadows across Terence's face. He knew the storm was coming, and he knew he had to be ready. Whatever secrets were buried, whatever truths were hidden, they were about to come to light. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, and yet there was a heavy, almost suffocating silence as the proceedings began. It was a scene that had been building for weeks, ever since the footage of Terence's arrest had gone viral. The media frenzy, the public outrage, the heated debates, it all led to this moment. And now, everyone was here to see how it would unfold, whether justice would be served or whether it would slip through the cracks once more. Terence sat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room. He was dressed sharply, his uniform replaced by a dark suit, but he still carried that same air of dignity and resilience. Beside him was Daniel, his attorney, who had been his pillar throughout this nightmare. On the other side of the room sat Officer Jared Thompson, his expression one of indifference, almost boredom, as if he were above it all. Next to him was his own attorney, a man known for his aggressive tactics, someone who had built a career on deflecting blame. The judge called the court to order, and the first part of the trial moved quickly, with both sides presenting their opening statements. Thompson's attorney tried to frame the incident as a simple misunderstanding, painting his client as a diligent officer just doing his job. But Daniel was methodical, calm, and precise in his arguments. He pointed out the inconsistencies, the unnecessary aggression, and how Thompson's actions were not just inappropriate but a deliberate abuse of power. The first few days of the trial were grueling. Witnesses were called, testimonies were given, and the footage was played over and over again, each time more painful to watch. It showed Terrence being forced down, handcuffed, humiliated. But it also showed the faces of the people around him, their shock, their confusion, their anger. It was clear this wasn't just about a single moment, it was about something bigger, a deep-rooted issue that had been festering for too long. Daniel had spent weeks preparing for this, gathering evidence, talking to people who had come forward, many of them with stories of their own encounters with Thompson. But what he had found during his investigation was something that changed everything, a discovery that could turn the entire case on its head. It was time to bring it to light. "Your Honor," Daniel said, standing up as the judge nodded for him to proceed. "I'd like to call a new witness to the stand." There was a murmur in the courtroom as a middle-aged man stepped forward, his demeanor nervous but determined. He was a former police officer, someone who had served with Thompson for years. The room quieted as he took his place, and Daniel approached him with a measured, reassuring tone. "Please state your name for the record," Daniel said. "Michael Harris," the man replied, his voice steady but low. "Mr. Harris, can you tell the court about your connection to Officer Thompson?" Daniel asked, maintaining eye contact. "I served with him for 6 years," Harris said, glancing briefly at Thompson, who was now staring intently, his jaw clenched. "I left the force about a year ago." "Why did you leave?" Daniel's question was pointed, but gentle, as if guiding Harris to a place he had been hesitant to go. Harris hesitated, his eyes darting around the room before he spoke. "Because I couldn't be part of it anymore. The things I saw, the things we were told to ignore, to cover up, it wasn't right." Daniel nodded, giving him a moment to collect himself. "And by it, are you referring to the behavior of certain officers, including Officer Thompson?" "Yes," Harris said, his voice growing stronger. "Thompson was protected. There were complaints, reports filed against him, but they never went anywhere. They were buried, dismissed. And whenever there was an incident, he was always shielded. I don't know who was behind it, but it was clear he had someone watching his back." The room was dead silent, every ear straining to catch every word. Daniel's expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Mr. Harris, can you explain to the court what you mean by incidents? Specifically, did you witness or hear about any events where Officer Thompson used his position to target individuals unjustly?" Harris swallowed hard, then nodded. "There were several. But the one that stuck with me, there was a young black man, about 2 years ago. He was stopped by Thompson for a traffic violation. Nothing serious, but Thompson escalated it. The guy ended up being arrested for resisting, but he never resisted. Thompson planted something in his car, made it look like he was carrying drugs. I knew it was wrong, but when I tried to report it, I was told to forget about it if I wanted to keep my job." The murmurs in the room grew louder, people whispering to each other, exchanging shocked glances. Daniel let it settle for a moment before continuing. "Why are you coming forward now, Mr. Harris?" "Because I've seen what's happening here," Harris said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I saw the footage of what Thompson did to Major General Walker. And I realized, if I stay silent, I'm just as guilty. I don't want to be part of this anymore." Thompson's attorney shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay, and it has no direct bearing on the case at hand." The judge considered it for a moment before nodding to Daniel. "Get to the point, Mr. Reed." Daniel turned back to Harris. "Mr. Harris, you're saying that Officer Thompson has a history of fabricating charges, particularly against individuals of color?" "Yes," Harris said firmly. "And I believe what happened to Major General Walker was no different. Thompson targeted him because he thought he could get away with it. The atmosphere was electric, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next." Daniel could sense the shift, the realization dawning on the jury and the audience that this wasn't just about one bad night. This was a pattern, a habit of abuse, and the system that had allowed it to continue. "Your Honor," Daniel said, stepping forward. "We have obtained internal documents from the police department, records that show a disturbing trend. Complaints against Officer Thompson that were never followed up, incidents where evidence went missing or reports were altered. This is not an isolated case. This is systematic." The judge's eyes widened slightly, and there was a ripple of whispers as Daniel handed over the documents. Thompson's attorney looked panicked, flipping through his notes as if searching for a way to stop what was happening. "I'd like to submit these documents as evidence," Daniel continued. "And I'd like to request that an independent investigation be launched into Officer Thompson's actions and the handling of complaints against him." The judge glanced over the documents, then looked at Thompson, who was no longer indifferent. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Thompson?" the judge asked, her voice cold, cutting through the tension. Thompson hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. I was just doing my job," he stammered. I didn't do anything wrong." "Was it your job to fabricate charges? To plant evidence?" Daniel's voice was sharp, piercing through the lies. "Because that's what the evidence suggests. And it's not just one case, Officer Thompson. It's multiple cases, over several years. So I ask you again, were you just doing your job?" The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting for his response. But Thompson said nothing. His bravado was gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow silence. The weight of everything he had done, all the lives he had affected, was crashing down on him, and there was no one left to protect him. The judge looked at Thompson's attorney, who could only shrug helplessly, and then back at Daniel. "We will proceed with the review of the evidence," she said. "And if what you say is true, there will be consequences. This court will not tolerate abuse of power, especially when it is directed against those who have served this country with honor." As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, Terence felt a wave of emotions wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since that night in the parking lot, he felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about exposing a truth that had been hidden for too long, about bringing justice not just for himself but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. "But we're getting there." Terence nodded, his mind still processing everything. They had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. And whatever lay on the other side, he was ready to face it. The courtroom remained tense, every seat occupied, as the second part of the trial resumed. The story had already taken an unexpected turn, with the revelation of Officer Thompson's past misconduct shaking the foundations of the case. But there was still more to uncover, and everyone knew it. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, chanting, holding signs, demanding justice. News vans lined the streets, reporters delivering live updates, and social media buzzed with speculation. People were glued to their screens, waiting to see how this would end. Inside, Terence sat next to Daniel, feeling the weight of the moment. He had expected to fight to clear his name, but now it felt like he was fighting for something much larger. As the proceedings continued, Daniel stood up, ready to present what could be the final blow to Thompson's defense. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice echoing through the room, "I would like to call our final witness to the stand. Someone who can provide clarity on Officer Thompson's actions, not just on the night in question, but on a larger pattern of behavior." The judge nodded, giving Daniel permission to proceed. There was a stir of anticipation as a young woman stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took her place on the stand. She was nervous, her eyes darting around, but there was a determination in her gaze that cut through the fear. "Please state your name for the record," Daniel said. "Jasmine Morales," she replied, her voice steady despite her evident anxiety. "Ms. Morales, can you tell the court about your connection to this case?" Daniel asked, his tone gentle but firm, guiding her through what was clearly a difficult moment. She took a deep breath, then spoke. I work in the records department at the Baltimore Police Department. My job is to file and manage reports, including complaints against officers." There was a pause as the room absorbed this information. Daniel nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And did you come across anything unusual in your work related to Officer Thompson?" Jasmine hesitated, glancing briefly at Thompson, who was now staring at her with a look of disbelief and barely contained anger. "Yes. There were several complaints against him, reports that should have been investigated, but they were marked as resolved without any follow-up. I thought it was strange, so I started looking into it on my own." "And what did you find?" Daniel pressed. She swallowed, her voice wavering but growing stronger. "I found discrepancies. Reports that were edited, details that were removed, complaints that disappeared from the system. It was like someone was trying to erase them. And then, I found an internal memo, one that mentioned a special arrangement to make sure certain complaints against Officer Thompson never reached higher authorities." The courtroom erupted into whispers, and the judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Daniel let the noise die down before he continued. "Can you tell the court what this special arrangement entailed, Ms. Morales?" Jasmine nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the stand as if for support. "It was a deal. Someone in the department was protecting him, making sure he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. And it was all documented. The memo mentioned a name. Captain Morris." Thompson's face drained of color, and across the room, Captain Morris, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly shifted in his seat, his eyes wide with shock. "That's a lie!" Morris shouted, standing up, his face red with fury. "I never." "Order in the court," the judge demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Captain Morris, you will have your chance to respond, but you will not interrupt this testimony." Morris sat back down, his hands shaking. Daniel turned his attention back to Jasmine. "Ms. Morales, are you certain of what you found? Do you have evidence to back up these claims?" "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I made copies of everything, because I knew if I reported it, they would just try to cover it up again. I have emails, memos, and internal reports that prove Officer Thompson was being protected, and that Captain Morris was part of it." The courtroom was electric, the tension palpable. Daniel walked over to the judge's bench, handing over a stack of documents. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit these as evidence." The judge took the papers, skimming through them with a frown that deepened with every page. "We will take a recess to review this evidence," she said, her tone heavy. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour." As the judge left the room, the tension that had been building suddenly broke, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed out to file updates, people in the audience murmured to each other, and Thompson turned to his attorney, who looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "What the hell is this?" Thompson hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you said this was going to be easy." His attorney didn't answer, just stared at the documents with a look of utter disbelief. Meanwhile, Captain Morris was frantically talking to his own lawyer, gesturing wildly as if trying to figure out a way to contain the damage. Terrence watched all of this unfold, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. There was satisfaction, seeing the truth finally come out, but there was also anger, a deep, burning anger at how far they had been willing to go to protect one man, to allow him to continue hurting others without consequence. He turned to Daniel, who had returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" Terence said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I had a feeling. When Jasmine reached out, I knew we had a chance to do more than just clear your name. We could expose the whole system that's been covering for people like Thompson. But I didn't know how deep it went until now." The hour passed slowly, every minute dragging by as people waited to see what would happen next. When the judge returned, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. She looked stern, her expression giving nothing away, but there was a sense that the tide had shifted, that this was no longer just about one officer's actions but a much larger, more insidious problem. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice carrying across the room, "It is clear that there has been a gross abuse of power, not just by Officer Thompson but by those who chose to protect him. This court will not tolerate such behavior, and there will be further investigations to uncover the full extent of this corruption. Officer Thompson, Captain Morris, you are both hereby placed under investigation, and until this matter is resolved, you are relieved of your duties." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Thompson's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, it looked as if he might lash out, but he restrained himself, his hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Terence. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." But Terence wasn't intimidated. He stood up, meeting Thompson's gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "It is over. For people like you, it's over." There was a silence that followed, a silence that felt like a release, as if everyone in the room could finally breathe after holding their breath for too long. Daniel turned to Terence, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Looks like we did it," he said softly. Terence nodded, but there was no celebration, no sense of victory yet. He knew this was just the beginning, that there was still a long way to go to fix what was broken. But it was a start, and sometimes, that was all you could ask for. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras thrust into their faces, voices overlapping as they shouted questions. "Major General Walker, how do you feel about the outcome? Do you think this will lead to real change? What do you want to say to Officer Thompson?" Terence stopped, turning to face the cameras. He could see the faces of people watching, people who were waiting for him to say something, to give them hope. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "This is about everyone who has been treated unfairly, everyone who has been silenced or ignored. It's about standing up and saying that enough is enough. We're not just going to let this slide. We're going to keep fighting, until the system changes, until everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Daniel guided him through the throng of people, Terence couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't the end, but it was a victory, and it was one he had earned, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless. But as they reached the car, Daniel's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen, his smile fading. "What is it?" Terence asked, noticing the change in his expression. Daniel looked up, his eyes serious. "I just got a message, there's more. The investigation has uncovered something else, something about Thompson's connection to other officers, and it's not just local. They think there might be a larger network involved." Terence felt his heart skip a beat. "What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said, his voice grim, "that this might be bigger than we thought. And if that's the case, we've only just scratched the surface." The car drove off, leaving the courthouse behind, but the sense of finality that Terence had felt was already slipping away. There was still more to uncover, more to fight for. And as he looked out at the city passing by, he realized that this was just the beginning of a much longer battle, one that would demand everything he had, but one he was ready to face. As the car sped through the streets of Baltimore, Terrence's mind was already shifting from the courtroom victory to the new, unsettling revelation Daniel had just shared. They had managed to expose Thompson and bring Captain Morris into the light, but the possibility of a larger network, one that spanned beyond local law enforcement, meant that this fight was far from over. Terrence felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, a sense of duty he thought he'd left behind on distant battlefields, but now it was here, right at home. Daniel's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "They're calling for a federal investigation," he said, his voice tight with a mix of urgency and caution. "If this network is as big as they're saying, it's going to shake things up. We're not just talking about a few bad cops. This could be systemic." Terrence nodded, processing the implications. "So, what's our next move?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "We keep the pressure on. The public is watching, and that's our best leverage right now. But, Terrence, you need to be prepared. If this gets bigger, they're going to come after you harder. They'll try to discredit you, drag up anything they can use against you. We've seen it before. They'll paint you as the aggressor, the troublemaker." Terrence turned to look at Daniel, his expression resolute. "Let them try," he said quietly. "I've faced worse. And if they think they can scare me into backing down, they don't know who they're dealing with." It was late afternoon by the time they arrived back at Terrence's apartment. The air was thick with the heat of a summer day, and the neighborhood was quiet, almost peaceful. But that peace was deceiving, masking the storm that was still brewing beneath the surface. As Terrence stepped out of the car, he saw a small group of reporters lingering nearby, their eyes lighting up as they recognized him. One of them, a young woman with a microphone, approached cautiously. "Major General Walker, can we ask a few questions?" she said, her tone polite but insistent. "How do you feel about the new developments in the case?" Terrence paused, then nodded. He had avoided the media as much as he could, letting Daniel handle most of the statements, but he knew this was an important moment. The people needed to hear from him, not just from the lawyers and the officials. "I feel relieved," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Relieved that the truth is finally coming out, that we're starting to see accountability where there hasn't been any for far too long. But I also feel determined. Because this isn't over. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, and if there are people out there who think they can abuse their power without consequences, they're wrong. We're going to keep pushing until every last one of them is held accountable." The reporter nodded, her eyes bright with the promise of a good headline. "And what do you think about the possibility of a wider network being involved? Are you concerned?" Terrence didn't hesitate. "Of course I'm concerned. But that's why we can't stop now. If this is as big as it seems, it means there are more people out there suffering, more lives being affected. We have a responsibility to see this through, no matter how hard it gets." As he finished speaking, there was a ripple of applause from a few people who had gathered nearby, their support a small but powerful affirmation. Terrence gave them a nod of gratitude before turning back toward his apartment. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers of admiration and curiosity. It was a strange feeling, being thrust into the spotlight like this, but he was ready to bear it if it meant making a real change. Inside, Daniel was already on the phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. Terrence poured himself a glass of water and sat down, his mind still buzzing. He knew there was a lot at stake, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. When Daniel finally hung up, he turned to Terrence with a serious expression. "That was one of the federal investigators," he said. "They've started looking into the links between Thompson, Morris, and other departments. They're finding some pretty disturbing connections, officers across different precincts, even in neighboring states, all involved in similar misconduct. It's like they were operating with some kind of unspoken agreement, covering for each other." Terrence felt a chill run down his spine. "How deep does this go?" "Deep," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're talking about a network that could span across multiple states, maybe even more. They're going to need more than just our case to bring it all down, but we've given them a starting point. And that's why it's so important that you stay visible, that you keep speaking out. They can't ignore this if the whole country is watching. Terence nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But as he sat there, he couldn't shake a thought that had been gnawing at him since the trial. Daniel, what happens if this network is even more powerful than we think? What if they have people high up, people who can just shut this down? Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. That's always a risk. But that's why we need to keep the pressure on, why we need people to care. The more public this is, the harder it will be for them to sweep it under the rug. But you're right, Terence. This could get dangerous. There are people who won't want this to come out, who might do whatever it takes to protect themselves. There it was, the unspoken fear that had been lurking in the back of Terence's mind, now laid out in the open. A moral dilemma, a decision that weighed heavily on his conscience. Was he willing to keep pushing, knowing the risks, knowing that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become? Was it fair to ask others to stand with him, to face that same danger? But then he thought about all the people who had reached out to him, the messages of support, the stories of others who had been mistreated, who had been silenced. He thought about how he felt that night in the parking lot, with Thompson's knee in his back, the feeling of helplessness, of humiliation. And he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. I'm in this, he said, his voice steady. Whatever it takes, I'm not backing down. If there's more to uncover, then we'll uncover it. But we need to make sure that the people who are doing this can't hide anymore. We need to shine a light on every corner they're trying to keep dark. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. I figured you'd say that. That's why I've already set up a meeting with some civil rights organizations. They want to back you, help amplify your voice. This is going to get bigger, Terence, and you're going to need allies. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and interviews. Terence found himself standing on stages, speaking to crowds, his words echoed by thousands who had gathered to support the cause. Every speech, every statement, was a battle cry, a call for justice that resonated far beyond Baltimore. He was no longer just a victim, he had become a symbol, a rallying point for a movement that was gaining momentum with every passing day. But with that momentum came new challenges. There were threats, anonymous calls, messages warning him to stop, to keep his mouth shut. Daniel's office was broken into, files rifled through, though nothing appeared to be missing. It was clear that someone was trying to intimidate them, to send a message that they were getting too close. But instead of scaring Terence, it only made him more determined. One evening, as they were preparing for yet another meeting, Daniel received a call from one of the federal agents. He listened intently, his expression growing darker by the minute. When he hung up, he turned to Terence, his eyes serious. They've identified someone higher up, he said. Someone who's been orchestrating this whole thing, making sure complaints disappear, protecting officers like Thompson. They're planning to bring him in for questioning, but there's a catch. Terence raised an eyebrow. What kind of catch? They think he knows we're onto him, Daniel said. And if he feels cornered, he might try to make a run for it, or worse, destroy any remaining evidence that could link him to the network. They need you to make a public statement, to draw him out, to make it clear that this investigation isn't going away. It was a risky move, one that could backfire spectacularly. But as Terence thought about it, he realized it was the only way. If they could force this man into the open, if they could catch him off guard, they might finally have a chance to bring down the entire network. All right, Terence said, his jaw set. Let's do it. I'll say whatever it takes to make sure he can't hide. Daniel nodded, picking up his phone. I'll make the arrangements. But Terence, be careful. This is going to put a target on your back, more than ever. Terence met Daniel's gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "I've had a target on my back for a long time, Daniel. If it means getting justice, I can live with that." As the evening drew on, Terence prepared himself for what was to come. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, that they were walking a tightrope with no safety net. But he also knew that this was a fight worth fighting, a cause worth risking everything for. And as he stood before the cameras once more, ready to make his statement, he felt a sense of calm, a clarity that came from knowing he was on the right side of history. The courtroom was quieter than it had been throughout the entire trial. The tension that had hung over every proceeding, every revelation, had finally dissipated, leaving behind a sense of anticipation. Today was the day when everything would come to a close, when the truth would stand unchallenged, and those who had abused their power would face the consequences. The federal investigation had uncovered a network far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Officers from multiple precincts, administrative staff, even some officials within the state's judicial system had been implicated. They had relied on each other to cover up complaints, manipulate evidence, and silence anyone who threatened to expose them. But thanks to the tireless work of investigators, and the courage of people like Jasmine Morales and Michael Harris, the entire operation had been laid bare. Terence stood at the front of the room, facing a wall of cameras and a crowd that was both somber and hopeful. He had spoken many times in the past few weeks, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just about what had happened to him, it was about justice finally catching up to those who thought they were untouchable. Officer Thompson was there, but the man who had once stood so confidently in court now looked small, defeated. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to deflect blame had fallen flat. He had been charged not only for his actions against Terence but also for multiple other incidents of misconduct, each one further solidifying the image of a man who had used his badge as a shield for his cruelty. Next to Thompson, Captain Morris sat with a resigned expression. His attempts to deny involvement, to claim ignorance, had crumbled under the weight of the documents and testimonies that painted him as a key figure in the network's protection. Today, the sentence was read aloud, both men were found guilty, and the judge did not hesitate to make an example of them. Years of prison time, stripped of their ranks, their pensions, their reputation, everything they had used to shield themselves was taken away. As the verdict was delivered, Terence allowed himself a moment to breathe, to let the weight of everything sink in. This was what he had fought for. But as he scanned the room, he realized that this victory wasn't just his. He locked eyes with Jasmine, who nodded at him with a look of quiet relief, and with Michael, who had taken a risk to speak the truth. They had stood up when it mattered, and now, their bravery had changed the course of so many lives. Daniel stood by his side, smiling, the tension of the past weeks finally lifting. "I'd say that went about as well as we could have hoped," he said, his voice soft, but there was a brightness in his eyes. "I think you did it, Terence. You actually made them listen." "Not just me," Terence replied, shaking his head. "It was all of us. And it's not over. We still have to make sure this doesn't happen again." Outside the courthouse, the crowd was waiting. As Terence stepped out, they erupted into cheers, holding signs that said things like, "Justice for all," and, "Accountability matters." For once, Terence felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that all the pain, the humiliation, and the struggle had led to something meaningful. He approached the microphone set up for the press conference, waiting for the noise to settle. When it did, he began to speak. "Today, justice was served, but this is only the beginning. We've seen what happens when good people stand up, when we refuse to let those who abuse their power go unchecked. We've seen how strong we can be when we stand together. But this is a fight that has to continue. For every Thompson, for every Morris, there are others who think they can use their authority to hurt, to oppress, to silence. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, until there's no place left for them to hide." The applause was deafening, and for a moment, it was as if the entire city had come together to share in this moment of triumph. As Terence stepped back, Daniel turned to him, grinning. "So, "What now?" he asked. Terence looked out at the faces in the crowd, the signs, the cheers. "Now, we rebuild," he said. "We make sure the changes stick, that the system can't just sweep this under the rug the next time. And we make sure that the people who've been ignored, who've been hurt, finally get to have their voices heard." The weeks that followed saw massive reforms within the Baltimore Police Department and beyond. New protocols were established, independent oversight was implemented, and officers who had once been protected were now under strict scrutiny. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a foundation upon which true, lasting change could be built. For Terence, the journey had been grueling, but he had emerged not just victorious, but as a leader in a movement that would continue to grow. He was offered positions on various boards, asked to speak at universities, and became a vocal advocate for justice reform. What had begun as a fight to clear his name had turned into a mission to ensure that no one else would have to go through what he had endured. And as for Thompson and Morris, their fall was a cautionary tale. In the end, they had not only lost their positions and their freedom but also the very respect they had once commanded. They had believed themselves invincible, but the truth had proven otherwise. They had underestimated the power of truth, of resilience, and most of all, of community. Wow, what a journey! Terence Walker's story isn't just about one man's fight against injustice, it's about the power of truth, and what can happen when people refuse to back down. It's about courage, not just in the face of adversity, but in the face of a system that tried to silence those who dared to speak out. It's a story that reminds us that change is possible, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against us. Think about it, how many times have we heard of people being mistreated, of those in power abusing their authority, and thought, that's just the way things are. But this story shows that it doesn't have to be that way. That when people like Terence, Jasmine, and Michael come together, when they stand up and say, enough, they can make a difference. They can spark a change that echoes far beyond their own lives. So, what do you think? Would you have had the courage to do what Terence did? What about Jasmine or Michael? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, because it's one that needs to be heard. And hey, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist. We bring you powerful, real stories with unexpected turns that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that subscribe button, and make sure you don't miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.